Off to the farm, are you?
I'm gonna speak up for you, you know, at the court-martial. It might do you some
I doubt
good.
it, but thanks.
Wilson, with me, I need a gunner.
Over here! I'll do it! Rackham, let me help!
You don't deserve to fly.
Wilson! If I'm gonna die up there.
Come on, let's do this.
You sure you don't want to sit this one out?
Not a chance.
You owe me a bloody medal!
Hello, Warfighters. War is hell. Welcome to the next episode in the series where I'm playing Battlefield 1, but talking about the history of World War I in an attempt to hopefully make you guys enjoy the game a little bit more by understanding some of the history behind what you guys are playing. And just kind of get some cool stuff to be able to talk about, too. So as we reach the end of the portion of the campaign that deals primarily with aerial combat, I found it only fitting to talk about the evolution of aircraft throughout World War I. And there's a lot of cool things to be able to discuss. I mean, even if you take a picture of an aircraft from 1914 and another one from 1918, you're going to see a huge difference between the aircraft, and how those evolutions came to be are very, very interesting. So I'm somebody who really enjoys aviation. As a kid, I memorized so many stats on airplanes and stuff like that that I'm just super excited that I get to talk about this, but also sad that this part's kind of ending. So, you guys may have noticed a few times throughout this part of the series, or just by playing the game yourself, that aircraft are commonly referred to as kites. And if you think about how these things are made at the beginning of World War I, it's not too different than what an actual kite would be made out of. It's primarily cloth and wood. And so these things were so fragile and so rough to fly that even a 20-mile-an-hour gust of wind sometimes was enough to be able to knock these things over. And this is one of the things that really lead to two schools of thought taking place in World War I about how aircraft are going to be used. On the one hand, you've got a side who's very much thinking ahead on how aircraft can be used. For example, in 1911, there's a piece of legislation that's proposed at the the Institute of International Law in Madrid, which was hoping to effectively ban aircraft as being used as a weapons platform. The fear was that if aircraft were armed, that they could attack undefended cities, which went against international laws governing warfare at the time. And we see, of course, in World War I, but in a much larger scale in World War II, exactly how much that came true. You know, you've got what happened in Japan and Germany and London and so many other places around the world that the cities were just bombed. And so you've got people who understand how aircraft can be used, but then you've also got another side who just thinks these things are worthless. And primarily, that train of thought was coming from a lot of people who were in some pretty high spots in militaries of all of these countries that were going to war in the First World War. Even though that they'd been used in warfare before, they still questioned how effective they were going to be. So, you've got somebody like Sir John French, who's one of the top generals for the British. Now, he didn't like the idea of aircraft in war at all. He thought they were too frail, too inconsequential. He was a cavalryman and honestly thought that cavalry would continue to provide the crucial reconnaissance needed for their army to engage in combat effectively. However, as we know, machine guns and horses don't mix too well, and it became very apparent early on that cavalry were not going to provide that type of intelligence that they were going to need, and so aircraft started to fill that role. At the beginning of World War I, the British Flying Corps, which was the organization that did all the flying, had only 100 aircraft, and they were soon quickly used for reconnaissance. And the role that they would play in the area providing reconnaissance was actually shown very early for the British. On August 22nd, 1914, Captain Charlton and Lieutenant Wadham were flying, and they reported that German General Alexander von Kluck's army was preparing to surround the British Expeditionary Force. Now, this went against absolutely everything that the British were getting. However, this one piece of intelligence really played a huge factor in making sure that the British Expeditionary Force survived the early parts of World War I. And so, yes, everybody was on board with aircraft providing reconnaissance. What they would do in the early parts of the war to be able to provide reconnaissance is you would have, of course, a pilot in the front and an observer in the back. And the observer would have a sketchbook and basically draw what they saw. And then the pilot would just fly over an HQ, and the observer would throw the notebook in a bag out of the airplane, and then it would be retrieved and the intelligence would be passed on. That, of course, changes later on, though, as they even go so far as on a lot of these aircraft to be able to put, or they put an insert on there so they can just sit a camera on the side of the airplane. That way you don't have somebody trying to move around and, you know, gets the picture out of focus. Then they go and take pictures of what they're seeing on the lines. So aircraft pilots, you know, really saw each other at the beginning of the war as fellow aviators, and they didn't want to shoot each other. But it became pretty apparent how vital this information was and how quickly the role of aircraft was beginning to expand, because in addition to just providing intelligence, these aircraft would also provide the role of artillery spotting. You see, like, that balloon up there, and balloons all around this portion of the map, a lot of balloons like that are used to be able to spot artillery and help them make adjustments to be able to make sure that the shells fall exactly where they're supposed to. Now, the problem was, of course, with aircraft, you couldn't write it down in a sketchbook and drop it off the side of the plane over an HQ if you need to make a quick change. I mean, you need to have that instantaneous correction, and so they were soon fitted with wireless telegraph systems, so that way they could just use Morse code to be able to help the artillery make their adjustments. So the whole philosophy of pilots being like in a fraternal organization, they didn't want to shoot each other, almost that quickly went away once it became apparent that aircraft were doing a lot of good for all the different nations involved, and it was absolutely imperative that they had to be taken down. When pilots do start shooting at each other, what they use is just regular rifles. The British use Lee Enfields. And so you've got an aircraft going 65 miles an hour, probably shooting directly at another aircraft coming right at them at about 65 miles an hour. That's like trying to hit a stationary target at 130 miles an hour. It's not going to be that effective. Did some people get shot down? Yes, of course they did, but there needed to be a way to be able to be more efficient than that. So the idea of using machine guns to protect aircraft was instituted and brought to the forefront. And there was even another thought here about having planes that were specifically dedicated to shooting down and protecting other aircraft. Hence, the fighter was born. Now, nobody really knew how to dogfight. That's when two aircraft just duke it out. Now, it's called dogfighting, too, because it looked like dogs chasing each other's tails. I mean, once they mounted machine guns at the front, which was not an easy thing to do with these things being as fragile as they were, you know, you could only shoot, of course, from the front, and so you try to get behind your enemy. Anyway, Oswald Boelcke, who I talked about a little bit in the video about Manfred von Richthofen, or the Red Baron, was one of the first people to come up with a series of tactics that everybody should use. It became known as the Dictabolke. All right, so he would say things like, try to secure the upper hand before attacking. If possible, keep the sun behind you. Always continue with an attack you have begun. Open fire only at close range, and then only while the opponent is squarely in your sights. Stuff like that. You know, there's actually a whole series of things that he talks about that is just absolutely important. But that starts to get passed around, and then official tactics begin on how fighting should be waged in the air. And that really transformed a lot of things, because then we started to see aircraft become more efficient at taking each other out. Now, as I mentioned, putting aircraft on, or putting machine guns on the aircraft was not an easy thing to do, because these things were not that stable at all. Remember, 20 mile an hour gust of wind was enough to be able to just knock these things over. In a lot of cases, they became unflyable when you put machine guns at the front, you had a pilot, and you had an observer, the way that they wanted to do it. So there were some changes that were made on how aircraft were designed to be a lot stronger, but also, too, there was an issue with shooting a machine gun from the front of the aircraft. Now you've got a propeller that's spinning at the very, very front, and if people didn't have the machine gun right, it would just shoot off the propeller, and that would just obviously destroy your own plane, and you'd go down in one of the most terrifying and probably most embarrassing ways you can as a pilot. And so there was a lot of different ways that people thought, all right, how are we going to solve this problem? What are we going to do? So one French pilot by the name of Roland Garros put these little deflector wedges on his propellers, and they were made out of metal. And so the thought is while the propeller was spinning, if a bullet fires in between the blades of the propeller, no problem. But if the propeller's there, once the bullet fires, these metal deflectors will just knock the bullet away. No harm done. Just wait for the next bullet to be able to make it on through. Now, this was pretty revolutionary at the time. Having this was absolutely critical to success of both the air forces on both sides, like having a way to be able to fire a machine gun effectively from the front of the aircraft. And so, as he was flying, trying to take down an enemy fighter, he'd taken out 3 already. He ends up crashing to the ground due to ground fire, and he crashed behind enemy lines. Now, since he's behind enemy lines, it's very possible that the Germans are going to get this technology or get this idea on how to make sure that bullets don't blow off the propeller. And so he tried to burn his plane, lit it on fire, but he wasn't able to destroy everything. And the Germans come up, they capture his idea, and they pass it on to a guy named Anthony Fokker. Now, Fokker's legendary in aircraft creation, and he was from Holland. And at the beginning of the war, right before, he originally pitched his ideas to the British on how aircraft could be used and some of his ideas on how he could accomplish those things that he was wanting to do. However, the British turned down his ideas, and so he ended up going to the Germans, where they accepted what he was wanting to do, and as I mentioned, he was pivotal in aircraft design. Now, one of the things that Fokker did, however, is he invented what is called the interrupter mechanism. What this was supposed to do was to synchronize the firing of a machine gun with the spinning of the propellers. If a propeller was going to be in a position that would be shot off by a bullet from a machine gun, then it would prevent the machine gun from even shooting. So that synchronization just changed everything on how aircraft were being used. And with the Germans being the first people to implement this, they had such a tremendous tactical advantage during that early parts of the war. For example, 82 planes are shot down in what's known as the Fokker Scourge. Once they start putting these on aircraft and having better aircraft as a whole for combat, the Germans completely have the advantage. So what the British do is they don't have this interrupter mechanism here. So they come up with the FE-2B, which was a pusher airplane. Now this needed some ingenuity in itself, because rather than putting the engine at the front, it went ahead and put the engine at the back of the plane, and it would push the aircraft in the air as opposed to pulling it. Now, a problem that they face, though, is if you have the person at the very front with a machine gun that they can move around, the bullet casings are going to fly back into your propeller, and so they had to go ahead and invent a way to be able to capture all of the casings from the shots. But 1916, you see more changes that take place when it comes to aircraft, partially because once the pusher aircraft, the FE-2B, is put out, it kind of eliminates the Fokker Scourge, because they've got something, while not quite as good, the British do have a way to be able to counter what the Germans have kind of put through. You also have Bloody April, which took place when you've got new aircraft that are being put out that just absolutely decimate British, and after that you see just so many different planes that are kind of out there to kind of counter each other. However, at the end of the day, Germany can't keep up with the industrial might of the Allies, and that kind of ends the evolution of aircraft. But that's going to be it here for this episode. Thanks so much for watching. I sure do appreciate it. More, of course, of this to come later on, so make sure you guys subscribe if you haven't already. War is hell, but you don't have to worry, because warfighters, I've got your six.
And that's my story. A selfish man who risked his own life to save another, and in doing so, found he was saved himself. Things get mixed up in wartime, though, and you'll probably hear other versions. A rogue pilot who stole a plane, who killed his buddy, then lied, cheated, and murdered his way across half the Western Front, only to escape court-martial in the chaos of an air raid. But don't listen to any of that. What you heard from me is the truth. I wouldn't tell you if it wasn't. Would I?